Kleiner Mikro. Ich teste auch nochmal das Mikro. Funktioniert wunderbar. Okay, let's start. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests. A very warm welcome to all of you. It's a great pleasure to see you here in Hamburg, and I would also like to warmly welcome everyone joining us via livestream. My name is Susanne Wilke, and I'm the head of the Northern Germany Regional Office of the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for Freedom. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this event on behalf of the Foundation. Thank you for being with us tonight for our discussion, Challenge for the West, BRICS and India's Special Role. I'm especially pleased that we are hosting this event together with our valued cooperation partner, the German Asia-Pacific Business Association. Thank you for your support in making this event possible. The topic we are discussing tonight could hardly be more timely. We are meeting just a few weeks ahead of the BRICS Summit in New Delhi in mid-September, at a moment when international attention is increasingly focused on the future direction of the BRICS grouping. This makes today's discussion particularly relevant, as it offers an opportunity to better understand the internal dynamics of BRICS before its leaders come together in India. BRICS has grown significantly in recent years, both in size and in global ambition. At the same time, its members do not always share the same interests or strategic priorities. India, as the current BRICS president, the world's most populous democracy, and an increasingly influential global actor, plays a particularly important role in shaping the future of the grouping. What does this mean for Europe? How should we understand the internal dynamics of BRICS? And what role can India play in a changing international order? These are the questions we hope to explore together this evening. We are delighted to welcome an outstanding group of speakers. First of all, let me welcome Eva Kuhlmann. She's the chair of the Committee for European and International Affairs of the FDP Hamburg. She's going to give the opening remarks to our event. Welcome. Okay, so please stand up. Our keynote presentation will be given by Mr. Pramit Pai-Chaudhuri. Welcome to you, an international recognized expert on Indian foreign policy and political economy. He's also the author of the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation's new study on BRICS internal dynamics and India's role, which forms the basis for today's discussion. Following the presentation, we will continue with a panel discussion featuring Mr. Pramit, Professor Miriam Pryce-Hansen, head of GIGA's research program on global orders and foreign policies, and Mr. Toby Chance, member of the South African Parliament and representative of the Democratic Alliance. It's a great pleasure to have you all with us tonight. Yes, thank you. The discussion will be moderated by my colleague and project lead for India of the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation, Mr. Stefan Schott, whom I would also like to thank for guiding us through the evening. A special word of appreciation also goes to our colleagues from the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation's office in New Delhi, whose expertise, commitment, and preparation have been essential in organizing this event. Their close connection to developments in India has been invaluable in shaping tonight's program. Thank you very much for your outstanding work. The evening will conclude with closing remarks by Sascha Tam, Head of International Dialogue at the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for Freedom. Also to him, a big thank you for sharing his expertise and joining us tonight. And last but not least, before we begin, I would also like to thank you, our audience. We truly appreciate your interest in this important topic, and we hope that tonight's discussion will provide new perspectives and encourage an open exchange of ideas. After the panel, there will be plenty of time for your questions, and we warmly invite you to stay afterwards for our networking reception. We hope you will take the opportunity to continue the conversation with our speakers and with one another. So, thank you once again for joining us. I wish you all an inspiring, thought-provoking, and enjoyable evening. And now a warm welcome again to Ms. Eva Kuhlmann. The stage is yours.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion. I hope you can hear me properly. Oh, here we go. I'd like to thank Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for hosting this event and for commissioning the study that provides the basis for our conversation. My sincere thanks also goes to our distinguished speakers. Thank you for joining us and contributing your expertise to what promises to be a timely and important discussion. We meet at a particularly significant moment. In just a few weeks, India will host the BRICS Summit in New Delhi under its presidency. Sorry, you can hear me properly, can you? Thank you. India has framed its chairmanship around resilience, innovation, cooperation, and sustainability. This summit will therefore be an important opportunity to assess not only what BRICS seeks to achieve, but also how much unity and strategic coherence the grouping can actually develop. At a time of growing geopolitical tensions, shifting economic realities, and increasing fragmentation of the international order, BRICS has become impossible to ignore. For many years, BRICS was viewed primarily as an economic concept, a shorthand for emerging markets with strong growth prospects. Today, however, it's increasingly seen as a political platform seeking to amplify the voices of emerging and developing economies and to shape debates on global governance. This evolution deserves our careful attention as well as a differentiated analysis. BRICS is often described as a united counterweight to the West. Yet this description overlooks the very different interests, political systems, and strategic priorities of its members. The countries that make up BRICS may share certain frustrations with the existing international order, but they also compete with one another and pursue very different national agendas. Too often, discussions in Europe treat BRICS as if it were a coherent geopolitical bloc. In reality, it is anything but. Its members differ profoundly in their political systems, strategic interests, security priorities, and visions for the international order. These internal dynamics help explain both the growing relevance of BRICS and the limits of its cohesion. This is why today's discussion and Mr. Chaudhry's study is so valuable. Understanding the internal dynamics of BRICS is far more useful than simply asking whether BRICS is for or against the West. India, in particular, deserves special attention. India is one of the world's fastest growing major economies, a key center of technology and innovation, and an increasingly influential diplomatic actor. It is a member of BRICS, but also of the Quad, alongside Australia, the US, and Japan. It maintains strategic partnerships with Europe and the United States while preserving its tradition of strategic autonomy. India, therefore, does not fit neatly into established geopolitical categories. It often seeks to build bridges between them and to expand its own room for maneuver in the process. For Germany and Europe, this both presents opportunity and challenges. As liberals, we believe that international cooperation works best when it's based on openness, rules, free trade, and respect for international law. At the same time, we recognize that a more multipolar world requires more dialogue, not less. We should avoid viewing every international initiative solely through the lens of geopolitical competition. BRICS should not be dismissed as merely symbolic. It reflects a genuine desire among many countries of the global South for greater representation, more influence in international institutions, and greater room for maneuver in a changing world. These aspirations deserve to be taken seriously, even when we disagree with the policies or political systems of individual BRICS members. For Europe, this means avoiding two opposite mistakes. The first would be complacency, assuming that BRICS is too divided to matter. The second would be an overly simplistic bloc mentality, treating all BRICS members as a part of a single anti-Western camp. A liberal foreign policy pursues a more differentiated approach. We must defend our principles, individual freedom, rule of law, democracy, territorial integrity, and an open international order. But we should also remain open to dialogue and practical cooperation where interests overlap. On climate change, energy security, trade, digitalization, health, development. Engagement does not mean naivety. Dialogue is not endorsement. And cooperation in one area must not prevent us from speaking clearly about human rights, international law, or Russia's war against Ukraine. Germany and Europe should therefore seek partnerships rather than simply choosing sides. We should listen more carefully to the concerns of emerging and developing economies, strengthen our own economic and technological competitiveness, and offer credible alternatives based on transparency, sustainability, and mutual benefit. We should approach countries such as India with confidence, respect, and genuine curiosity. Germany has every reason to deepen its partnership with India, not only in trade and investment, but also in science, innovation, climate policy, education, and security cooperation. At the same time, we should pursue an honest dialogue wherever our perspectives differ. This is precisely what institutions such as Friedrich-Naumann-Stiftung stand for, creating spaces for open debate, encouraging intellectual exchange, and strengthening liberal dialogue across regions and political traditions. I hope this evening will help us move beyond simple narratives and develop a more nuanced understanding of BRICS, of India's perspective, of India's distinctive role within it, and of what these developments mean for Germany and Europe. I look forward to hearing from our distinguished panelists about the internal dynamics of BRICS, India's priorities, and the implications for European foreign policy. I'm especially pleased that Pramit Pal Chaudhry is with us today. Thank you for presenting your study and for helping us look beyond the headlines. I wish us all an inspiring and thought-provoking discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I'm very happy. This is my first trip to Hamburg. I've never been here before. I've been to other parts of Germany, so it's quite nice to be here. And I had been told Hamburg weather was bad, but I'm very impressed. So, as the BRICS is going to be, the next summit will be held in India on September 12th and 13th. It will also be the first BRICS summit of the expanded BRICS. The original 4 members, of course, became 5 with the addition of South Africa, and now it's up to 10, with Saudi Arabia kind of making up half, trying to decide whether or not it will join as a full member. It's presently an associate member. But there are now 25 other countries that have applied to join the BRICS. And so the BRICS, in fact, if anything, their problem is way too many countries are starting to join. It will also be, this summit in Delhi that is coming up, will be the first one, if they all show up, where Iran, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia, the leaders of all 3 countries, will be sharing an international fora together. Iran has already made it clear that their president, Pezeshkian, will come. We are still waiting to hear whether Saudi Arabia will show up, and we're expecting representation from the United Arab Emirates. Egypt will also be a new member, and it's a sort of ancillary party to the present conflict in the Gulf. Among the key questions that we're hoping to see determined at this summit will be, where do the new members sit regarding what I'll go into greater length about, is the very clear division between India and Brazil on one side and Russia and China on the other as to the future path of the BRICS. And where these new members sit will be one of the crucial questions that the summit will begin to look at. Particularly because some of those countries, notably the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, had been assumed to be pro-Western. But what has happened now in the Persian Gulf and their increasingly strained relations with the United States puts that under certain question. And as I've mentioned, India and Brazil have been the primary stalwarts against making this an anti-Western organization. But one of their concerns is that they will increasingly now be isolated within the BRICS if we have continuing changes in the larger geopolitics of the world. The BRICS, the clout of the BRICS, at the heart of it, of course, is the amazing dominance or rise of China. You'll see from the numbers here in terms of GDP, global GDP, at least in purchasing power parity terms, the BRICS today, and this does not include Saudi Arabia in its listings, is already at about 35% of the world's GDP. Its population, obviously driven by the fact that India and China are both members, is already about 45% of the world. And because oil is on everybody's mind right now, we're also 30% of the world's oil production and goods exports. It's about a quarter of the world's goods exports. But if you were to go to almost any other measure in terms of, let's say, critical minerals, rare earths, investment flows, BRICS would probably be roughly at about this level already. About a third of the world would be effectively coming out of the BRICS nations. Now, the heart of this, the BRICS, just a little bit of history, many of you may know, the BRICS began under the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who basically created a so-called Russia, India, China group in 1998. It was almost solely his personal idea. He thought it would create some kind of leverage for Russia in its negotiations with the West. It did nothing of the sort because neither India or China took it very seriously. But then, inspired by the Goldman Sachs report of the so-called BRIC, the future of the BRIC, and the rise of the emerging economies as a separate group from the developing countries, Vladimir Putin expanded this to the BRIC, added Brazil, and then held a summit in Russia, in Yekaterinburg in 2009. The BRICS has basically a large portion of its early history, South Africa, of course, joined later on, tended to rise in importance in at least the minds of these 5 original members when the West failed, when the West did something, struggled with itself. For example, the global financial crisis, they tended to take the BRICS a bit more seriously. But when the West incorporated the emerging economies, notably with the creation of the G20, you saw these countries basically stop taking the BRICS very seriously. When I was still a journalist, I accompanied then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh to a BRICS summit. And I remember as we were flying back on the airplane, I asked him, and he was a trained economist, how seriously should we take the BRICS? And he was quite dismissive. He said that an multilateral organization based on an investment bank report is a joke. The G20 is what we will take seriously in India as the primary multilateral economic organization. But however, the G20 has lost its way, and we'll see particularly this year when the United States, President Trump is hosting it, who he invites to the G20 is now increasingly uncertain. I've been told El Salvador will be invited because he likes the president of El Salvador. But the result is going to be that a lot of these multilateral bodies increasingly now no longer are functional in the way they should be, and particularly for the interests of the emerging economies, no longer functional. But the result is that the BRICS is becoming more and more important to a lot of these countries, and it's particularly becoming very important to China. Between roughly 2014 and 2015, in the report I cite, Indian diplomats, they said we saw a distinctive interest in Russia and China into pushing the BRICS as an alternative to the G20 and the G7. Initially the G7, but increasingly they see it as now an alternative to the G20. And importantly, the BRICS has no Western members. And that's really at the heart of what Russia and China have been pushing. So we now have an anti-Western BRICS group. As I've mentioned, these 2 countries at the forefront. Unfortunately, at least in India's view, South Africa has increasingly sided with China in a lot of crucial points. But Brazil and India have been very clear that the BRICS must remain effectively a non-aligned organization, a neutral, geopolitically neutral organization. And this has now basically defined internally what the BRICS has been doing for almost 20 years. And some of these battles, which I would argue have not really been in the public realm, is what I will now describe. But always find this will give you a sense of how strong the BRICS are getting if they were a united group, but just economically. In 2000, the GDP of the BRICS plus, this includes the new members, was half that of the G7. 15 years later, they basically overtook the G7. And in 2025, now they are basically almost 40% bigger than the G7 countries. And at present projection rates, by 2030, 2040, you're going to see them become twice the size of the G7 in terms of their economic clout. But the real story, I think, is going to be the battles that continue, the geopolitical battles within the BRICS. So I'll point out 3 times in which the BRICS have fought internally over this issue. And so far, because each country has veto power, BRICS is not determined. This makes its decisions not on the basis of a majority vote, but by a consensus. You're members of the European Union, you know what that's all about. So the first one was the battle over the BRICS currency. This was a proposal and a digital payment system. This was a proposal by China, led by Russia, but strongly supported by China, which basically said we need to break the back of the Western sanction system. And we must create a currency that will promote de-dollarization, reduce the role of dollar as a reserve currency. It was not an actual currency, it would be a benchmark currency, which would allow the various BRICS countries to set local currency trade, in other words, trade in their own currencies with each other, because most of the BRICS countries manipulate their currency rates. None of them are free-floating currencies. But I think the more important one was then the proposal that the SWIFT payment system, which is basically the heart of Western sanctions, both by the EU, by the European and American systems, that using blockchain technology, the BRICS could create its own digital payment system. The technology is quite easily accomplished. Most of the BRICS countries, definitely India, already have digital payment systems internally. That you could then completely go around the Western payment structure of the SWIFT. While India has been a victim of sanctions, both India and Brazil basically came out and said, we don't have a problem in principle with this, but we believe that ultimately this will mean that the People's Bank of China will come to dominate the currency payment systems of all of these countries simply because of the sheer size of China. And India was very clear that they would not allow Chinese access into the digital payment system of India. And as a consequence, that proposal then basically fell apart. The next battle, however, went in China's favor, which was the expansion of the BRICS. So in Brazil and India opposed an attempt by China and Russia to expand the BRICS. Their conclusion was that China was trying very hard to reduce the influence of these two countries. But we lost that battle, India in particular, because China ran a campaign against India, arguing that to Saudi Arabia and Ethiopia and Egypt and other countries, that India is trying to keep you people down. And supposedly a lot of their heads of state eventually rang Prime Minister Modi and complained, and eventually said, all right, we have no choice, we have to allow these countries in. And what you saw, interestingly enough, which I detailed in the report, is how the membership was actually designed to fight with each other. So the Iranians came in for the anti-Western group. India and Brazil supported UAE and Saudi Arabia, calculating that they would support the West, and so on and so forth. So you saw that membership come in a slightly bizarre fashion, but ultimately because of these geopolitical concerns among the various members. Where the two groups did agree was to create the BRICS Bank. The formal name is a New Development Bank, because of concerns that the West was not increasing the capital base of the World Bank, and that the IMF itself was becoming extraordinarily, the conditionality of the IMF were becoming excessively strict. And so the creation of both the BRICS banks and the CRA, the Contingency Reserve Arrangement, is a $100 billion IMF alternative. The CRA you probably have never heard of because it's never done anything, because while it was driven by the global financial crisis and the Eurozone crisis, it was realized that actually none of the BRICS members ever had a financial crisis after that, and we never used the CRA. All of the members had an enormous expansion in their economies and foreign exchange reserves, and have yet to use it. But the CRA still exists; it's there. It's just never been done. The BRICS Bank is interesting, and one of the reasons all the governments continue to support it, I would argue, are twofold. One is that it uses local currencies in payment systems. It is prepared to accept ruble or renminbi or the rupee for a lot of their projects. So you don't have to use dollars or euros or yen. And India's case, India tried to support it because it was part of an Indian attempt to get China to accept international rules regarding how it deploys its capital. Remember, China had launched the Belt Road Initiative and so on, and India said, well, we'll support the BRICS Bank, and China is the single largest shareholder, and also the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, again dominated by China, as long as they accepted the disciplines of the international system. In other words, basically roughly the same rules as the World Bank and the Asia Development Bank. That worked, but the problem that we had was that, and I'll show you later, China just basically rooted its capital outside the BRICS and the BRICS Bank and the AIIB. More recently was the Ukraine war. Russia tried to get the BRICS Bank to finance projects in Russia that had been sanctioned by the West. And India and Brazil led the battle against that, arguing that would only result in the BRICS Bank being sanctioned. This resulted in some bad blood, especially between Moscow and Delhi, because Moscow accused India of leading it. But again, the veto of India and Brazil together effectively stalled that. So simple notification of how little China cares about international rules and finance. 95.5% of China's external capital flows are done completely outside international financial rules. AIIB and the BRICS Bank represent less than 5% of what they do. And it was been very clear to India, at least, that China is not remotely interested in having anybody tell them how they spend their money overseas. So where is the future of the BRICS Bank going to be? The rivalry between India and China remains extremely intense. Even as we are speaking now, roughly 5,000 to 7,000 Indian soldiers are in a border standoff with the Chinese in the eastern Himalayas. Not well publicized. Well, neither government is making a noise about it, but they are actually in a military confrontation. But it's not clear that India will be able to sustain that position, at least when I've talked to Indian diplomats. Lula, for example, in Brazil, he is of a left-wing orientation, so he actually thinks de-dollarization is not a bad thing. And one of the problems we face is many of these countries, even if they are pro-Western in their position, have been so either angered or horrified by the Trump administration that they are no longer prepared to hold that position anymore. That's definitely the case we've been seeing in Brazil. The other thing which we're starting to see, and it's actually a sensible one, is South Africa, when they joined, argued that the BRICS needed to become more oriented towards representing the global South. In other words, not just the emerging economies, but also the LDCs, the least developing countries. And with these new members, countries like Ethiopia and so on joining, we will see a lot more of that voice. At least the developing countries as a whole will be joining the the BRICS in larger numbers. Many of them have already joined the BRICS Bank. You don't have to be a member of the BRICS to be a member of the BRICS Bank. And we've seen a lot of other, Bangladesh and others have joined the BRICS Bank as well. And the Chinese have been very clear that they want the BRICS to become the voice of the global South, because we face a problem in the international system, which is namely that there is no multilateral organization that now represents the global South. The G77 is dead, the non-aligned movement is defunct. You can go on a whole set of these organizations created in the 1970s in particular have basically fallen apart or have become irrelevant. And China is already, when you talk to the Chinese, are very clear about this, that they do now more trade with the global South than they do with the developed world. And becoming the leader of a multilateral organization that represents them, in their view, is going to be something that they feel that they can get away with. And obviously what I mentioned earlier, that the perception of Western decline, both of Europe, but definitely the United States now, is feeding into this larger idea that the BRICS should become is going to become something bigger for the global South. We don't have too much polling data on the BRICS, but as you can see, the rest of the world, as opposed to the G7, there is almost double the amount of support among those who actually know about the BRICS among the rest of the world, and this obviously represents mainly the global South and the developing world. A lot more negativity in the G7 about the BRICS, which is fair enough, but again, not so much elsewhere in the non-Western world. Favorable view of China, and you'll notice that the countries that are most likely to have a strong, a positive view of China are low-income countries. India is unusual, in fact, in being a lower middle income country and being extremely hostile to China. In fact, we have almost the same hostility as Germans do. But above that, if you look, you can see more, the lower the income the country is, it's more likely to see China in a positive view. These are the latest figures. If you were to posit that against America, which has seen a savage decline in approval ratings across these same countries, it looks, for China in particular, it looks very nice. We will see China push that agenda next year because the BRICS Summit will be held in China. And India in many ways expects that this will be the last summit in quite a while, because it'll now be almost a 15-year cycle before we end up holding the summit next time, that we will see a lot more of the anti-Western agenda coming through. So I'll just end by saying that nobody's claiming that the BRICS is functional as an organization. It's not. And given its very bizarre origins, it's not a coherent organization in the way that most multilateral, there's no history behind it, there's intense rivalries within it. But those rivalries are now shrinking to basically just, I would argue, India versus China. Because almost no other country, and the Chinese are quite open when they talk to us, they say, ultimately all the new members have more to do with China than they have to do with you or anybody else. And we will win this battle eventually because we're patient, we'll take our time. We know the BRICS will take a while to build, but they are very clear in their mind that this is going to be the future of their multilateral structure they will develop. And as I've said, at the heart of it will be that the West will not be part of this. Let me end there, and the rest of the panel, be free to join upstairs.
So thank you very much, Pramit. That was, I think, a brilliant introduction. And let me also take the chance to again welcome the other brilliant experts that we have on the panel today. Professor Miriam Priss-Hansen is an expert for geopolitics and especially on Asia. I need my glasses to not make a mistake. So you're the lead research fellow at the Institute for Asia Studies and head of the research program on Global Order and Foreign Policy at the Giga Institute. Thank you for being with us. And Toby Chance represents South Africa today. Toby Chance is Member of Parliament in South Africa. Whoops. He is with the DA, the Democratic Alliance, which is just a partner party of Friedrich-Naumann Foundation in South Africa. And the DA is at the moment in a coalition government with the ANC. First time the ANC is not able to govern alone since the end of apartheid. So the DA plays an important role in South Africa, and we are eager to hear your perspective on BRICS as well from the African side, and maybe you don't fully agree with what Pramit said on the South African position within BRICS. We are eager to hear that. But let me start by asking about the upcoming summit. We are just a bit more than 2 weeks away from that, and this will definitely be a big show. Up to 11 heads of state, not everybody has confirmed its participation, but it will be a big event. Will it just be a big show, or will that really mark a turning point in geopolitics? Maybe the first question goes to you, Miriam.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much for the invitation. I think there will be a lot of show, but the symbolism of it should not be underestimated. And I think a lot of things are going to happen on 2 tracks. Once in the negotiation rooms, where we are probably publicly not necessarily going to learn all of the things, and then a lot that's going to be out in the media, and that obviously will have to do a lot with what is going on in the Middle East. And then possibly, or not possibly, very certainly a third track that we shouldn't underestimate, and I think that is part of the BRICS importance, the bilateral meetings that will or will not happen, for instance, between Modi and Xi Jinping. In terms of outcomes, I think, and that's sort of what is reported also by a lot of think tanks, if there will be a joint declaration, that will be a success, because what has happened this year already, that, for example, the foreign ministers meeting in May could not come up with a joint statement because of tensions between the UAE and Iran above all. And so it will be curious for any observer to see whether there will be a joint statement, whether there will be things agreed upon beyond, because that's the crucial aspect of the BRICS. It's a consensus-based organization on many things, especially on the programmatic, sort of future-oriented aspects. There will need to be consensus. And I think the political security aspects that's going to intervene in terms of the heterogeneous membership will do a lot to prevent possibly a lot of sort of shared outcomes.
Toby, may I pass that question to you as well, and please give us your perspective. There is a certain danger that the conflict in the Middle East will dominate the summit. And there are Iran, there's United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, to a certain degree, Egypt involved. And so can that cause a complete failure of the summit as well?
I think, is it working?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's impossible to answer the question, actually. I think that this summit is totally indeterminate in the way in which it's going to pan out. Because I think that the expansion of BRICS has created a completely new dynamic amongst not just the members, but amongst the members and other parts of the world that are looking at it for answers. And of course, the Middle East conflict and the inclusion of more developing countries has also changed the perspective of each of the members towards the West, because the West has become, I think, even more of a question mark over its commitment to international relations. But when I talk about the West, I'm conscious of the fact that the West itself is divided, because of course we have the Trump administration versus the rest. And that has led to question marks over the extent to which the West or America can be trusted as a partner, which then results in membership of BRICS becoming more potentially significant as a way of feeling a part of world conversations. And I think certainly from the South African perspective, we were pushing for the expansion, and I think that we're probably happy with that. When I say we, and of course I have to explain that we as the South African government is not necessarily the same as we as the Democratic Party, or the Democratic Alliance, sorry, because although we are a member of the coalition, we have a very different perspective on foreign policy. We don't have the foreign policy portfolio. We never will have the foreign policy portfolio in an ANC-dominated government, because that would result in many of the assumptions behind South Africa's diplomatic position being challenged, and the ANC doesn't want that to happen. But going back to the question, I think a lot is going to depend on India's chairmanship, the way it's going to be able to finesse all the conflicts, and also many of the background discussions, which we don't really know about, and the extent to which, as you were saying earlier, the signatories are able to make a consensus statement at the end. Normally, when these consensus statements come out, they're very anodyne. They don't actually say anything in particular. They're just a way of trying to put out something which most people can agree on, but it actually says very little.
Yeah, that brings me to Pramit. Pramit, representing India tonight, and for India, this summit is important. It's important to the Prime Minister Modi, and India. What I've learned, I lived there, have been living there for a year now, is very professional in its foreign policy, and it's the brilliant diplomats. So India will do everything to make that summit a support. And at the same time keeping it on a neutral base or neutral level geopolitically. So what can this success for India look like? What kind of topics could be touched in the final declaration?
So as Toby's correctly said, the final statement probably will be very anodyne. I think what India will be looking for is hopefully that the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Iran actually show up and don't shoot each other. That would be in itself an accomplishment. The real game would be that if they are privately going to meet on the sidelines and have their own little discussions, if even two of them have a discussion with each other, that would be considered an accomplishment. And we're still waiting to see whether the UAE, we expect the UAE to show up in some form. Saudi Arabia is very clearly nervous about whether it wants to come in to that, and that's fine. The second part of it will be, and this is, I think, just on a slightly bigger story, which is the one thing the BRICS is actually very supportive of is green transition. If you look at the BRICS Bank, for example, the bulk of its loans are to renewable energy and infrastructure. One of the things when India hosted the G20 a few years ago is the Indian diplomats spoke to 140 governments around the world, especially in Africa, Latin America, and asked them, what do you, even though if you're not a member of the G20, what would you want the G20 to do at? And they all said roughly the same thing. Digital transformation, green transition, we don't want to be left out. But what we're not seeing is that the multilateral organizations like the World Bank are doing anything about helping us in these areas. So part of what India will be looking at is, can we get a convergence within the BRICS on promoting these transitions? The problem will be geopolitical, that India and China both have digital technologies, neither of them want to have anything to do with each other. And so how do you get around that problem? Green transition is a bit easier. The game, though, is to increase the BRICS Bank's capital base or create a new body, which is something they've been looking at de-risking private capital flows into those areas. Again, the problem is different. The BRICS Bank is structured so that each member has to give the same amount of initial capital. The problem there we face is South Africa, not because of South Africa's unwillingness to give money, it just doesn't have that much because it's a much smaller economy than the others. But if the other BRICS members now come in, can we change that? Because then we'll have Ethiopia as a real bottleneck. So that's another second part of what they'll be looking at. The third part of it is going to be the fact, which is a little bit more complicated. There are now over 60 BRICS bodies, little organizations from vaccines to connectivity to infrastructure. Most Indian diplomats I speak with, so what we're starting to see is China take over a lot of these bodies and slowly build up what may potentially become a rival to the World Trade Organization in terms of standard setting for trade and investment. And there India is a bit stretched because India is not a major trading power. And our capabilities and ability to support that will be difficult. But the game is, yes, if we can try to figure out a set of principles at least on that, again, aligning more or less with the existing Bretton Woods structure, that would be seen as an accomplishment by India.
Let's take some minutes to have a deeper look in the interest of the different BRICS members. I mean, we've talked about these two groups, China and Russia on one side, pushing to make BRICS an anti-Western initiative, and India and Brazil on the other side, and South Africa more leaning towards China. I would like to start with looking at the autocracies. So are China and Russia really the same, with the same position in this respect? Miriam, could you answer to that?
I can try. I'm neither Russia nor China expert, but I think they are, I mean, to say it briefly, pushing for some of the same outcomes, but underlying different logics. I mean, for Russia, the whole avoiding sanctions, it's a matter of survival, right? And all of the other pacts is sort of a matter of survival as an actor in the global system, economically, politically. For China, and some of the goals align, it is a matter of slowly building up the kind of structural dominance it wants to achieve in the world. So in that sense, the urgency, I mean, China, I think what I've learned from my colleagues that work on China is China has a lot of patience. And so I think while some of the goals are aligned, the pressures, the urgency, and the underlying logics are very different still. And I think that results in, some of the friction there as well.
Yeah, thank you. So, Toby, that's your chance to explain the South African position.
Yes.
Is it really leaning towards China, or is that too simple?
Yes, it is leaning towards China. I mean, if you look at for example, the trade relations between South Africa and other countries, South Africa's biggest trading partner collectively is the EU, although China is our biggest trading partner as a country. Third comes the United States, and then Britain and Japan. So we also have to look at the trade balance between South Africa and the BRICS nations, as well as other countries. We have a trade deficit with BRICS across the board. Every single country, virtually, we have a trade deficit. That's not the case with the United States. South Africa has a trade surplus with the United States. And with Europe, it's more even, although we now have a trade deficit with the EU. In terms of South Africa's balance of exports, most of our exports are primary goods, minerals, agricultural goods, unrefined metals. That is certainly the case with China. China represents 80% of South Africa's trade with the BRICS countries. So China is totally dominant. And I think politically the ANC leans towards China because they see it as a counterweight. They also see China as an unexplored market for value-added goods, which we are really dependent upon more and more because of the value add to job creation. But I think so far as South Africa's strategy at the BRICS Summit, and what are we aiming to get out of it? I think what we are aiming to get out of it is strengthening our relations with the new members in particular. And I think we probably want to become the lead of the smaller groupings. We're the largest economy in Africa. We're bigger than Egypt. We're bigger than Nigeria, a lot bigger than Ethiopia. But that also, the background to that is that we have a lot of internal issues which make our African brothers not happy. There's a lot of immigration resentment. There's a lot of xenophobia in South Africa. And that is also creating problems for South Africa diplomatically. So I think the main point I want to make is that we will see this as an opportunity for South Africa to cement its place in BRICS as the lead representative of the South, the global South.
Thanks. Pramit, would you help us to understand India a bit better? I think for Germans especially, this is a difficult position India has with its non-alignment or multi-alignment. We grew up, most of us, in the times of the Iron Curtain, so you were either on one side or the other. You were either west or east, or you were either friend or enemy. So, and India is somehow standing on all sides at the same time. So it's a BRICS member, it's a G20 member, it's member in some other organizations. It's talking to everybody. How is that possible? Please help us understand that.
Well, India officially has 120 languages, so talking to different languages is not that hard. Our constitution has, I think, 25 recognized languages now. So yes, I think that at the heart of it is one, arguably hubris on the part of the Indian leadership going back to independence, that India is large enough to be effectively an independent pole in the international system. But it's also driven by a sense that India, as Henry Kissinger once said, India lives in a tough neighborhood. It has Pakistan, it has Iran on one side, it has China above it, it has Myanmar as its other neighbor. So geopolitics in India is much more crucial to its thinking than necessarily values or trade or investment, because India has to go to war. It maintains a military of 1.5 million men and women because of that. I mean, one of the reasons in my argument about South Africa is not criticizing South Africa. It's a perfectly legitimate position South Africa takes because it doesn't have the geopolitical challenges we have. And we have one extremely hostile neighbor, because the one country we do not get along with is China. And literally since 1958, India and China have basically not agreed on anything with each other, and that relationship just gets worse. But we also recognize that China is 6 times our size in GDP, and that we don't expect anybody to fight on our behalf against China. So we have to be prepared to work to should we say, both talk and fight at the same time with China on a regular basis. But yes, I think the heart of it, one time, as explained, told me by a retired senior diplomat, he says, look, our problem is that if China is the core of our geopolitical problems, on the maritime side, we don't have a problem. We have a lot of democracies we can work with, which is why the Quad exists. Japan, Australia, the United States, and also, if you want, Korea and Indonesia and so on. The land side, the Eurasian side of it, if you wish, there are no democracies. Pakistan, Iran, Central Asia, Russia, there are no democracies. So we cannot afford that on the land side of it, that these countries should ever join China and Pakistan against us. So we must maintain a relationship with Iran. We must maintain a relationship with Russia, neither of whom have any problems with India. But under no circumstances will we ever want Russia, China, Iran, and Pakistan to join against India, because that would actually be an enormous challenge for India. So we keep them neutral. Or as one of our former ambassadors to Russia, and I asked him, I said, what is the point of the Russia relationship? It's obviously a declining one. Russia has less and less to offer. No Indian ever goes to Russia. There are more Indian students in Ukraine than there are in Russia today. And he just said, fundamentally, when India and China fight, we have to keep Russia neutral. And that is at the heart of what we have to maintain with the Russians. Fortunately, as he said, they're a bunch of gangsters, so all you have to do is give them some money, and they're happy. So we have to also treat them with a bit of respect. So we have streets named after Tolstoy, statues of Alexander Pushkin and stuff like that all across Delhi, and they're happy. So these are things that we do to keep them, but it's a simple, very hardcore balance of power geopolitical struggle. Luckily for India, I would argue, is that because we're heading to be the fourth largest economy in the world, we are a huge importer of hydrocarbons, various other reasons. Most countries we find are happy to come and talk to us. So they're very happy. Nobody wants to get into the bad books of India, but nobody expects us to ever be an ally in the normal sense of the word. And most countries are happy with that. The Iranians, for example, and the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, and Israel are all countries who are strategic partners of India. And they don't have a problem with this. I've asked an Iranian ambassador once, I said, you know, we are the biggest buyers of Israeli weapons in the world. And he said, as long as we will never tell you who your enemies or friends should be, but don't let your friends decide who your enemies should be. And he said, we and you are alike. We are both fiercely independent countries. Iran is perfectly happy with that.
Let's have a look at why BRICS is so successful. But as we have more topics to cover, so I would like to ask you for a bit shorter and to the point answers. I know this is also not so easy to explain, but we have to somehow simplify. So why are the multilateral organizations, the Western-dominated multilateral organizations, no longer attractive in the global south? Miriam, do you have an easy answer for that?
Yes, I think they're still very attractive. They are just making it very hard for them to actually have their voice there. And so I think what the BRICS offers, and I wonder about what you said about China taking over at some point. I wonder if not India is lending so much credibility and legitimacy to BRICS that it's absolutely necessary, and that China will also do a lot to keep India happy. That's on a side note. But I think that what is BRICS is very good is that it offers an opportunity not to have to choose. It offers this and its amazing ability to compartmentalize. So that India and China sit on one table and fight at the same time, or have very big. I think that is the big attractiveness for on sort of a symbolic side. And on the other one has to say access to China, to Chinese markets, to Chinese goods is, I think, another very big attractor. But at the same time, it doesn't force countries to choose between sides, and I think that makes it quite attractive.
Toby, I think I've also lived in Africa for some years, and one of the things that really surprised me is how different the world looks when you look at it from Africa. So we as Europeans tend to think that our values are superior. We deeply believe that we just want the best for the rest of the world, and we struggle with the fact that the rest of the world is not recognizing that. Why don't they see the world as we do it? And this is especially, you feel that in Africa when you talk to Africans. Do you have an explanation? Why does the world look so different when you look at it from Africa?
I think you have to look at the realities of the past and the future. Historically, Europe has been by far the biggest investor in Africa in terms of foreign direct investment, in terms of aid, trade relations. That is changing because of the, I wouldn't say retreat of Europe in the West, but by the aggression of China. And so if you go into various parts of Africa, you will see that the majority of the infrastructure projects, whether it be railways or roads or dams, are driven by Chinese investors. And also China doesn't place as many conditions upon its investment in Africa and other countries. We all know that, the Belt and Road Initiative. So I think it's partly Europeans being a little bit complacent, and they have to reassess their position competitively compared to mainly China. And of course, China is dominant India doesn't really have a presence in Africa to anything like the extent China has, and I'm not sure whether that's going to change. I don't actually know whether India has any ambitions, apart from trade, to expand its role in Africa. But I would also question the extent to which BRICS is that successful, actually. I think people overestimate the success of BRICS. I don't think you should get too het up about it, actually, as Germany and Europe. BRICS is more of a chimera. BRICS is a mirage. It's more defined by what it isn't than what it is. And I think that, you know, we're talking about the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for Freedom. BRICS is not about freedom at all. The BRICS members are mostly autocracies. Now that we have the addition of the new members. And this presents a real challenge, particularly for a country like South Africa, because we have the most liberal constitution in the world. We certainly don't have the most liberal leading political party in the world. So I think that that's really what the challenge for India and the other democracies is, to be more explicit and more outspoken about the issues that are facing human rights in the countries that are dominant. And so, you know, China and Russia would rather we didn't talk about those things, but we have to talk about those things. So I think that's the challenge, essentially, that those countries face and South Africa faces, so that we don't just compartmentalize ourselves as a trade group, but actually have some values and principles to stand up to.
Yeah, Pramit, you just told us that 25 other countries are applying to become BRICS members. So I would call that a success. And is that a failure of the West? Is that the main reason that we missed to offer them an alternative? Or should we just be more relaxed, as Toby says, and say, okay, this is a liberal world. If they sit at another table, let them.
So, I mean, look at the counterfactual. Let's say India and Brazil had not blocked what China and Russia had proposed. They had just said, okay, it doesn't matter to us, or we support some of these ideas. You would have then had a BRICS currency, which is broad purpose would be to provide an alternative to the dollar. It wouldn't necessarily have succeeded, but remember there was another Russian proposal, which was let's create a gold-backed currency of the 5 central banks of the BRICS, in which would slowly grow because it would be like what the dollar was before Nixon. And the idea was that it would not have much liquidity at the beginning, but slowly it would become, because it's gold-backed, effectively a stable reserve currency alternative to the dollar. That was shot down right at the beginning, but if you had even done the present one, you'd have started to see, the idea was at least, that a lot of trade, especially by China. A lot of countries are nervous to do trade in renminbi because the Chinese are completely untransparent about how they set their currency. But a benchmark currency set by the 5 countries potentially could have attracted more interest and would have been essentially a growth. But in my view, the creation of a BRICS digital payment system would have been transformational because it would have knocked off a third of the world from the SWIFT system. At which point, Western's financial sanctions would have almost certainly collapsed. It would be almost impossible for the US or the EU, which are right now, this is their primary weapon in the international system, would have essentially ceased to exist. Similarly, if the BRICS Bank had been allowed to expand, it's only about a 50 or $60 billion loan portfolio right now, which is about 1/10 of the World Bank. But China wanted it to be much, much larger. And if that had been allowed to happen, you would have had a genuine rival to the World Bank. Because a lot of the members, new members who are applying, are looking at the BRICS Bank and saying, if I can make payments in non-dollar, or I get project, then it's so much easier for me to function as an economy. You would have started to see literally a genuine alternative to and one of the biggest failures, and I remember this because the Biden administration had complained to the Indian government about this, is that the World Bank, the bulk of green energy finance in the world is private. But your problem is there's no system for a global South country to de-risk that finance. You can't get insurance for that. And the World Bank does not do that at all. They have an organization, MIGA, which is supposed to do that. MIGA's record is pathetic. They've actually had one bad loan in their entire history, indicating that they don't take any risks at all. And the Biden administration had complained. In fact, Janet Yellen had said at one point, we need a new Bretton Woods body, which is specifically about green finance. It was never created. The Trump administration has gone the opposite direction. It has withdrawn or destroyed 60 international climate and environmental organizations now. So we're seeing a total reversal. So again, the potential for the BRICS Bank to do something on that path would have been there. So you could have had a whole bunch of things. And interesting, South Africa led the idea of military exercises by the BRICS. And I think it was at the Durban Summit, South Africa actually held a BRICS naval exercise, which had actually not been cleared by the other BRICS members. India in particular and Brazil both, Brazil sent an observer, India refused to be part of it, saying we're never cleared by us. But that was the first time we actually had a military, it was about maritime security, but you had a naval exercise under the BRICS banner. So you're starting to see a new path in which China was the primary operator in all of that, of a military, BRICS actually starting to go down a military path.
In Pramit's presentation, we've also learned how China sees the future of BRICS as a platform for cooperation with the countries and among the countries of the Global South, and an instrument to align their interests and to articulate their interests on a geopolitical level. Isn't that a legitimate reason? I mean, this doesn't exist. We see how these economies and these countries become politically and economically more and more influential and important. So why shouldn't they align their interests? Toby, if we start with you.
No, it's totally legitimate if you're a Chinaman. And obviously, as you said, China has a very patient outlook on diplomacy and most things. So they're prepared to wait. They're prepared to hope that the Trump approach to international relations will persist. It's unlikely that it will, I think, after the next election. So I think that each country is inevitably going to pursue its own interests. That is the purpose of any country's mission. And those countries are going to obtain different things from different relationships. Remember that South Africa, for example, is a member of the G20. We were the chairman of the G20 last year, and all countries turned up apart from America. South Africa was also de-invited to the G7 meeting in Paris just a few months ago because of American pressure. I'm sure that America won't invite South Africa. So that means that we have a gravitational pull towards BRICS, because it gives us a more stable platform. But I just want to pick up on another point in your earlier question. I think that if you look at debt, African debt, the debt holders are mostly Western banks. And I think the most significant thing that the West could do to reassert itself in Africa would be to introduce a debt forgiveness strategy and introduce a way in which we can see lower interest rates for capital invested in Africa. That would have a massive impact. And I think that would do a lot to shift perceptions around who actually cares more for African development, China or the West.
I saw you nodding when Toby said it's a legitimate interest. So why should we be concerned? Maybe we can put it this way. Is there a worst case scenario? Something you see that the direction BRICS could go that really is damaging the interests of the West or becoming a threat to the values that we stand for?
Yeah. So I think one thing we need to see and be very clear about, for all of the BRICS members, BRICS is one option of many in a multi-aligned world. And I think what you just said, as long as we see shared interest, it's going to be important. But I think BRICS, I mean, I've been following the BRICS since 2009. It's been going, up and down. And I think there's no reason, like, if countries do not see their interest pursued via BRICS, it's not going to disappear, but it's going to, bubble along without much impact. And I think that is definitely something that can happen in the future with the expanded BRICS and the absence of sort of shared outcomes rather than only shared grievances. The worst case scenario. So I think what we can see is this coming together of Trump, the breaking apart of the Western alliance, and now BRICS. And BRICS doesn't need to agree on something. It can just sort of not agree to stuff. I mean, for example, on the European case, it cannot agree to condemning the Russian war. And by that is already, at least for the EU, a pretty bad outcome. It can, and that can extend to all kinds of issue areas. So the ability to veto by not agreeing to things, by coordinating to not agree to things, I think is already a pretty big thing in a time where the Western alliance is breaking apart at the same time. So I think I would put as rather than, building up a NATO-like structure, I think that is highly unlikely, but blocking global governance efforts in various directions is a pretty big threat.
I mean, isn't BRICS somehow a surprising construct? It's such a diverse group. Autocracies, democracies, completely different stages of economic development, diverse interests, and still it's so successful. So that there must be something, and something. Can we grab that a bit clearer, or describe it a bit clearer, and is that something that should threaten or scare us? Pramit, maybe you can answer that.
Right. So as I've made the argument in the report that the BRICS basically was going nowhere until about 2014, 2015, where a series of events, but particularly the rise of China as an economic power, really saw China begin to take the BRICS much more seriously. I would also add, and I mentioned this in the report, that there's an anecdote there. The Chinese public liked the BRICS. For example, during the height of the Eurozone crisis, you may remember the IMF tried to create a so-called Great Firewall. They were asking emerging economies and the United States and other countries to commit to $300 billion as a capital reserve for literally fear that the Eurozone would collapse, in which case the global contamination needed to be somehow arrested. They asked China to commit to $40 billion. A Chinese deputy governor of the central bank went public on Chinese television and said this is a good idea. Huge reaction in Chinese public on social media. Why should we help, white Europeans, rich people who destroyed the Summer Palace, fed us opium, blah, blah, blah. And so the Chinese actually withdrew that. They just said that was his personal opinion. When the Los Cabos G20 summit was held, the Chinese then came to the Indians. I flew with the Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh then, and said, "Look, we want to give to the Great Firewall, but we're having a problem with our public. Can we do this as a BRICS proposal?" And India said, "Fine, because we're happy for you to join the IMF. Well, but we'll see what happens." And so the 4 members of the BRICS and Mexico, the host, joined in, committed over $100 billion to the Great Firewall, with China contributing $40 billion. And afterwards, I remember I was in the press center and I was talking to the joint secretary from one of our joint secretaries from our foreign ministry. I said, "How did it go?" They said, "Oh, the Chinese came and said it worked perfectly. Our public was like, the BRICS is ours. So if the BRICS does it, it's good. If it's done by any Western organization, unacceptable to the Chinese public." So within China, you start to see the idea that the BRICS is something that we can use because both is it not only popular, but it fits in with a larger geopolitical agenda that we have. And the sense within China repeatedly now, I would argue, Russia is sort of on and off because its commitment, it doesn't really have the resources to commit very much to thing, but that the West is in decline. And whether it's a global financial crisis, the Eurozone crisis, the Trump presidency, so on and so forth, the weak reaction arguably to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. All of this points to a future in which the West increasingly does not matter. I should add, when you're quite right, the Chinese have an interesting view on India. There's a very nice speech, there's a great speech about 25 years ago by a Chinese diplomat made in Calcutta, who basically gave her a speech, and it was literally 7 reasons why India will never succeed. Number 1 is you're a democracy. Okay, that was the first off. You're a democracy. Democracy just does not work, and your country is no chance because you're a democracy. But what they do argue with the Indians is that yes, we're never going to be friends. But what you need to understand is your attempts to become close to the West is a waste of time. The future is with us, and you need to accept that you have to be the number 2 partner or number 3 partner in Asia to China. You can remain a democracy or whatever crazy system you want to be, but the West is a waste of your time. And that's really the heart of what they keep, which is one of the reasons they never go beyond a certain point in fighting India. Their view is that what we need to do is persuade you that you're wasting your time with the United States, with the Europeans, with the Japanese, that this is just some stupid phase in your history. And you will eventually understand that in Asia, there is only one power that matters, and it's China.
Let's turn to the question how we, the West, should deal with BRICS, and what are smart answers to BRICS. And I would like to start on a very general level, on a meta level. So I think Europe, we Germans especially, live in the perception that we have enough crisis at the moment. We deal with the war in Ukraine, we have to invest in our defense, energy prices have gone up, we have problems with migration, and we could continue this list by other crises that we are dealing with. You just mentioned Trump and the uncertainty of the transatlantic relations and so on. And now we learn that the Global South has somehow been neglected and is turning towards BRICS and China. And so do we have to refocus and pay more attention to the interests of the Global South? Miriam.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there is some rethinking. I mean, so far, what one could say is that the EU, Germany, has been reactive to things that happen in the Global South. It has seen the Global South primarily through its lens about how it perceives, for example, threats emanating from there. And I think what we need, and I think, for example, and that you can do it, can be seen that now finally the EU-India free trade agreement has been concluded. The EU-Mercosur agreement has been concluded with some, problems along the way. So I do think it needs to take a more active and less reactive stance. And I think with regard to BRICS, what it absolutely should not do is to throw all BRICS into one. But by focusing on bilateral incentives, bilateral sort of win-win situations, I think that would be the way to go. Because by sort of throwing all BRICS into one, which Trump has done, for example, I mean, this threat of tariffs on whoever contributes to that sort of BRICS payment infrastructure has actually produced the opposite by sort of pushing them together. And so I think by treating all BRICS as one, it makes it much more harder for Modi or Lula or whoever to argue that it's not anti-Western. So I think more active, less reactive response. Speed, I think, is a matter, because I think many will know the saying, if you talk to China, you get an airport. If you talk to the EU, you get a lecture. I think there's truth to that. And so speed, non-hypocrisy, CBAM is going to be a big problem if we need to talk about that. I think there's a lot of things that can be done, but I do also see moves in that direction.
Toby, I think you mentioned that the course of history goes in the direction of China. And we saw the figures of the economic, the development of the domestic products of the BRICS plus compared to the G7. So what chance do we have when the economic facts point in this one direction so clearly?
I think the first thing is that everybody likes to belong to a club. And most of the new members don't belong to clubs, not any clubs of any significance. So that in itself is an attractive proposition for them. Come and join us, you know. And politicians, speaking as a politician, politicians love summitry. They love that to have their photograph taken, you know, in a line alongside all other world leaders. And I'm afraid that is one of the you know, the features of being an egotistical individual. You like to be seen to be amongst others who are leading the world, and that's a very cynical viewpoint. But I don't think it's to be dismissed. And I think that the other point is Europe mustn't, or the West. Remember that the West isn't the West geographically. The West is a set of values. The West includes Australia, Japan, South Korea, Canada, Europe, South Africa potentially. Those values are very important to the world's stability and continuation of development. If you look at the principles of the rule of law, property rights, freedom of the press, democracy, those things underpin and have underpinned human development for the last 200 years. I think it would be a grave mistake for Europe and the West to abandon those principles. So I think there is a fight back here. You know, Russia and China are not in favor of human rights. They're not in favor of personal freedoms. And those are facts that are going to come back and bite them at some point. It's certainly within Russia. And if you look at the inevitable curve, okay, forecasting is not exactly a science. And I think that we can't necessarily expect China to just have continual growth forever and a day. I don't think that's necessarily the prospect. China is a middle-income country, and it's potentially hit the the middle-income trap. So there is unrest potentially in China as well. So it's a race. I think China is seeing that there's a race to get to the global dominance before it starts to have its own internal problems. So the West mustn't give up. The West must continue to be assertive of its values and promote those values to other countries of the world, and maybe create institutions which allow them to join. So, for example, the Commonwealth is an example of a club which, I mean, there's absolutely nothing in common between members of the Commonwealth other than their association with the old British Empire. But many countries that have never been part of the British Empire now want to join the Commonwealth. Why? Because it's a member of a club that has commonalities. They have the games every couple of years. They do these sorts of things. So maybe the West needs to think about what type of club can we create that would enable other members to join that would be a counterbalance to BRICS.
I should add that we've allowed Mozambique and Rwanda to join, neither of which are part of the British Empire. So Germany can apply.
Maybe we should.
I said the United States should join. They actually are a former British colony.
What comes out of the report very clearly is that so far, India and Brazil stopped many anti-Western initiatives that came from China and Russia. Is there a way that the West can support this role that India and Brazil play? I imagine that it's really difficult because India, and I assume Brazil as well, don't want to be seen as Western proxies, doing Western agents doing the job of the US or Europe. So it has to be done in a smart way. And do you see a way to do that, Pramit?
So one of the things we're starting to see, which is somewhat outside the BRICS, is what Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, in Davos called middle power strategies. This was also laid down by India, by our foreign minister in speeches in January and August last year. He just said, we in India have we all have a problem, which is that the two superpowers no longer are willing to underwrite, in fact, are now prepared to undermine the international system. We must embrace middle power cooperation. Japan has been really at the heart of that for India. I mean, the amount of work we now do with the Japanese, including, for example, I was working with the Japanese government on a combined Indo-Japan plan for Africa. The pivot to Europe by India is now the second part of that. We'll see that. We'll see an FTA with Canada probably signed this December at the same thing, especially since Canada is now under siege from the United States. Already under the Quad, we work very closely with the Australians on a whole set of even bilateral issues. And these middle powers are basically all democracies. It's not an immediate element of that, but it's just a natural progression among these countries. So the game for a lot of us right now are starting to see is we're looking at India working with the Japanese in Africa. We're looking at working with other countries, some of these other, with the Australians in the South Pacific. India now has a Pacific Island Forum in a part of the country India has never had any relationship with whatsoever. But we've seen Prime Minister Modi go to Papua New Guinea and so on. And a lot of the South Pacific Islanders are very enthusiastic about India because we've introduced digital structures to them. We introduced a satellite telecom link for Micronesia and so on, which for some reason nobody ever bothered to do before. I don't understand. We were actually surprised when they said, we'd like you to do this for us. And the game is now, can we do something similar with Europe? Can we do something on that lines in other countries? And now with the Brazilians, who are a part of the country, India, India has no relationship with Latin America. India is being invited to come and do things in Latin America, which are getting part of the game is, can we start to merge those together? Because that's the obvious next step in middle power strategy, is to get these middle powers, all of which are actually quite capable on their own. They have limits because they've assumed that the United States would do all the hard lifting, heavy lifting for all of us. But can we do that now is, I think, part of that story. And I said India-Japan is now on an amazing relationship. The amount of supply chain cooperation we're seeing with the Japanese, the amount of money coming in from the Japanese, deliberately Japanese are working on making specific supply chains independent of the US and China working with India. I would say the Canadian-European relationship is on a very similar, much tighter bond there exists, and so on. So that's going to be part of that story. That's one element of it. And as I mentioned, there are big gaps in the international system. And I think on green finance, I've mentioned one element, where you have a lot of countries in the global south that want to be part of the green transition, and nobody's helping them. I was talking about the Biden administration. We had the Biden complain to us. They said the World Bank is useless in green finance. They do projects, but they will not handle capital flows. They said, we don't do that. We don't have no idea. We need to do something about it. It's not that difficult. As Toby correctly said, if you look at polls in like the Afrobarometer done on African countries, support for democracy is incredibly large. Most Africans like the idea of being under democratic rule. The problem is increasingly, I would argue, they don't see the West as the place to help them get that. We've seen, for example, in the Sahel region, I also lived in Africa for 13 years of my life, is the complete collapse of French influence across the Sahel in West Africa. It's been staggering that this is a part of the world that was completely oriented towards France. They are now extraordinarily hostile to France. You've seen that collapse. You've seen a similar problem with Britain and the Anglophone countries. We're seeing bit by bit a lot of the Africans just saying there's no point in talking to the Europeans. I mean, Trump just hates us anyway, so it's not even pointless talking to him anyway, but we don't see what the Europeans bring to the table anymore. So some kind of coherent policy on that front is needed. And again, I'm hoping the middle powers we can work with. One of the reasons India and Japan are working together on this is our polling that the Japanese did. They said the Africans are not hostile to India or Japan. They're just seen as neutral countries, and that they're happy to work with us if we can provide them something.
Before we open the discussion for questions from our audience, I would like to do one last round with you, talking about free trade, foreign direct investments, and also the existing multilateral institutions like IMF, World Bank. So obviously, these institutions are not working perfectly. They are not open enough or accessible enough. And these instruments like trade and investments, how can we improve that? What needs to be done to make these traditional Western instruments more attractive for the global South as a counterweight against BRICS? Toby,
Can I open that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot is said about free trade by countries that don't practice free trade, unfortunately, and that is partly the reason why the WTO has lost its reputation, its significance, because it doesn't enforce its rules. So, for example, in South Africa and many African countries, we see huge surge of Chinese exports coming in through our country, whether it be motor cars or steel or other goods. And we seem to be powerless to deal with it, whether through tariffs or through negotiations, at a bilateral level. So I think that the financial institutions or the world institutions that monitor and manage world trade have got to be more assertive, first of all. But secondly, I think that the countries that have been the major trading partners, again, I come back to the point about trade finance, have got to be more aggressive and more open towards facilitating trade finance and making it possible for countries to actually engage with each other. Certainly within Africa. Africa's internal trade represents only 20% of its total trade. And I think that if that were to be facilitated through institutions backed by the West, that would have a catalytic effect on development within Africa. Non-tariff barriers are a real issue within African countries, and that's something which I think also can be facilitated by the West, because we'd have to deal with things like port entry and exits, corruption at border posts. The road infrastructure is terrible, the rail infrastructure doesn't exist. So those are the things that I think could really make a difference to Africa's perception of who has a real interest in our development.
Whoever, Pramit, go. Yeah.
Trade and investment. India is not a major trading country, but it is increasingly, curiously enough, an investment source, not because of the Indian government, but because of the private sector of India. So Toby mentioned that India doesn't really factor in capital flows to Africa. But curiously enough, I was talking to the Japanese who had done a very careful study, and they said actually India's overtaken Japan as an FDI source to Africa, and is actually, it's probably, they said, you're probably very close to overtaking the United States. So I was surprised. I said, I don't think the figures in India. They said that's because you're looking only at the government's figures. A simple example, one of the biggest conglomerates in India, the Tata Group, is the third largest or second largest in the country. They said the Tata Group is the largest industrial manufacturer in Britain as well. It happens to own huge numbers of companies in Britain. They said, but Tata, when it invests in West Africa, does it through Tata Britain. Why? Because capital costs are cheaper in London. It's easier to raise than it is to in India. But obviously what is registered in the books of, let's say, a Nigeria or a Liberia is that it is FDI from Britain, even though it is 100% owned by an Indian company. So he says, once you calculate all of that, you suddenly find India jumps right up to being the third or fourth largest source of FDI now in Africa. And they said this is multiplied across a whole set of different companies in East Africa, for example, and so on. And that doesn't even include the Indian diaspora, which in places like Kenya and Uganda are phenomenally wealthy in terms of their economic profile. So for the Indian government, I think part of the Indian government needs to do is capture this in its own head, because I don't think the Indian government recognizes this itself, or what this means in terms of what it can do. So that's part of that story. I think trade facilitation, correctly, I think is a huge problem because more than, I mean, unfortunately, things like CBAMs make it even more difficult to calculate over these things. So what we need to be able to do is work out a degree of standardization, which is much simpler for the Global South. You end up putting in way too many regulations. All that happens is no trade takes place. You need at least to have a second bunch, which is the problem with the WTO, in my view, is that it became so incredibly difficult to follow the millions of different standards that were being imposed that a African, Latin American country basically just said, this is impossible. I will just export 1 or 2 basic commodities and I'll go to sleep. And supply chain integration basically just disappears altogether, especially high-end supply chain integration. The other thing that I think, especially in Europe, will need to accept eventually is you have to go down a plurilateral path. Global standards are simply not going to cut it in this world today. The geopolitics is now incredibly poisonous. The weaponization of supply chains across the board is much greater than even what is in the public realm right now. Simple things like India is trying to build up a two-wheeler EV infrastructure ecosystem. The Chinese are now denying Indian engineers in that space visas to come to China because they don't want them to learn about what China is doing in that space. China is forcing Indian companies to transfer part of their manufacturing to China in return for access to permanent magnets and so on and so forth. And it's now very systematic what the Chinese are doing. So they accept, and these are technically not in violation of the WTO because the WTO doesn't go down that depth. So what you're really starting to see is India, Japan working out their own set of rules and regulations, which are plurilateral. The Quad is not a military alliance, despite whatever that we read in the press. It is about technology standards. It is almost completely the 28 sub-working groups and working in the Quad, 26 of them are technology. Semiconductors, green hydrogen, so on and so forth. It's about the future of advanced industrial technology standards among those countries. And these are the kind of things that we now have to start looking at. And the global side, sadly, we should hold on to it. It's important. But we start to kneel. And that's why I think with the EU after the FTA, the next step, which I know both sides have agreed on, is to revive the Trade and Technology Council with India and make it into a Quad system for both sides.
Yeah, I mean, this is a discussion at a liberal foundation, so we believe in trade and in the power of free trade, entrepreneurship. Miriam, can you give us some hope that this will help us in this context as well, in the geopolitical competition with BRICS?
A lot has been said, but I want to point at some projects like that in principle work in that direction, that create co-benefits, infrastructure investments via the Global Gateway, the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, that in itself is a great principle, but just suffers from a lot of sort of domestic issues on all sides. So there are projects, and I think there are programs that are pointing exactly in that direction, creating co-benefits, not charity, and I think that's a key aspect of that.
So it's time for you. I hope you use the last minutes to think about some questions. Whoever wants to go first. Do we have mics? Yeah, we don't? But I think the room is not so big, so...
We can share one of ours, yeah.
You can share one here.
Yeah. So who would like to go first? Anyone that's always...
This is now a BRICS microphone.
Any questions?
Yeah.
The only thing we don't have an answer for is the state of German football.
Do you think it's likely that China will try to use BRICS for their own goals?
I think they already are. Their problem is that the consensus rule makes it very difficult. Their hope is that with the expansion, this is going to be easier, because the heart of it is, if we can isolate India or Brazil, in that case, they will have no choice but to back down. And that's definitely what happened at the expansion. Brazil was actually the hardest nut to crack. But when India succumbed and it was just Brazil by itself, the Brazilians said, we can't be the only country opposing it. We can't be isolated. So we backed down. I think one of the things that in India, we're trying to map, and so far we haven't all that so good. China has another organization, which is the Shanghai Community, the Shanghai SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which was created by them and Russia as well. But China now completely dominates the SCO. Russia is almost a secondary member. India is also a member of the SCO, but not a founding member. And in many ways completely isolated within the SCO. I think we're the only democracy there, for example. What we're seeing with the Chinese, and we fought them even there, not so successfully, but like Chinese wanted to create an SCO bank. India vetoed it. They wanted a similar thing with the BRICS bank. India vetoed it. Chinese created their own bank and just called it the SCO bank anyway. But it's not actually an SCO thing. What we're starting to see, in our view, is that the Chinese are aligning what they're doing in the SCO, especially on trade and logistics, with the BRICS. And our view is that fundamentally the Chinese want to merge those two bodies together at some point, not necessarily formally, but create, in effect, two bodies, one on the Eurasian side and one on the global side, which will effectively both be dominated by China, but will become increasingly oriented to what Chinese standards and trade and concepts are.
So, yeah, there's one more.
If the BRICS current organizations, countries are inviting future countries to join, will that, I mean, I would think that this will be a big challenge, because the interests will be even more different than they are now. I mean, for example, India's beloved neighbor, Pakistan, has just joined or has started to form a military cooperation with Turkey and Saudi Arabia. So, I mean, if Saudi Arabia maybe not part of BRICS, but if other countries like Pakistan wants to join BRICS, I mean, they cannot be excluded. But that would then, I mean, be a big confrontation with India, because, I mean, we all know they don't like each other, to be polite.
That I can tell you will not happen, because India will use its veto on Pakistan. In fact, China doesn't even bother to promote Pakistan as a member, simply because they know there's no way they can get a consensus. I mean, the expansion only works, new members can join if all the members agree on it. That has to be a universal, unanimous support. Which is why, for example, in my view, South Africa, that's why Nigeria is not a part of it, because South Africa, a little wary of allowing Nigeria. Nigerians are really angry that they've never been invited, but it's very clear that South Africa is not interested. In the same way that Brazil makes sure Mexico is not a member. They don't want
Venezuela.
Yes, right. They just say we don't want to. But if you look at the new members have applied, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to get in. But what we're seeing is two big clusters. The first group of Latin American countries have applied. Colombia and Uruguay, for example, and so on. Paraguay, I think, as well. And a group of Southeast Asian countries, Thailand, Vietnam. And what we're starting to see, and I think this, for me, is interesting, American military allies joining for the first time. Traditionally, the countries that were military treaty allies of the United States stayed away from the BRICS. They said, this is not an organization for us. UAE, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia were the first to join, who are actual military allies of America, have formal treaty obligations very similar to NATO. Now you're starting to see a whole series of them walking off and saying, Mr. Trump may not like the BRICS, but we still want to join.
Yeah.
Can I just add something to that?
Sure.
I think the point that you made earlier, Pramit, about the potential use of BRICS as a military entity is very important. So just to clarify what he was saying, there were naval exercises off the coast of South Africa at Simonstown base, which involved Russia, China, and Iran. And That was at the invitation of the South African Navy. But when President Ramaphosa became aware of it, he basically told Iran to get lost, because he knew the consequences of that with America would be dramatic. But the Iranian ships came, but they were observers. I think that if the new BRICS members start to succumb to Chinese pressure to have military ties, then that will become a serious problem. Whether that is part of China's endgame is hard to say at this point, but certainly I think that would cause a rift, which would be very difficult to negotiate out of.
Yes.
Yes. So good evening. Thank you for the wonderful discussion. I just have one question from the European Union's lenses. When I look at BRICS, Brazil, I would go in another way. Russia and China do not have FTAs with EU. Brazil and South Africa does. India is on the path of concluding an FTA. How is then, and also as Mr. Chaudhary mentioned about Vietnam, UAE already holding FTAs with EU. What is the internal feeling of BRICS considering European Union as a partner, or can it be segregated as the term of West?
I don't think there's a joint feeling. I mean, there's not an ambition to have a joint position towards the EU or feeling. I think, I mean, I said this before, BRICS is one tool of many, and it's used for certain interests, but completely sidelined or just not significant for others. And I think bilateral relations to the EU is one of the things that are simply not a matter for BRICS to discuss, to evaluate, to have an opinion on. So I think the sovereignty, the claim for sort of uninterrupted, unintervened sovereignty of each of the member states is just much more important than that. So I don't think there's a view on that.
Would you like to add on that?
No, I agree with that. And I think that the position that BRICS countries should adopt is being a member of BRICS doesn't mean to say you can't also have free trade agreements. That must not be a condition of BRICS. You know, BRICS is an opportunity for countries to join, but it doesn't mean to say that those other relationships must be compromised.
Can I just add something
Sure.
on that? And applying to become a BRICS member is extremely cheap because it doesn't exclude. I mean, I'm not surprised a lot of people, a lot of states want to join because at this point it's cheap. It can only benefit. I mean, it's not coming through. It's not a big deal. So I think, and that's sort of also partially an answer to that.
I don't see, there's another question. I think this should be the last, then we can do a last round of closing remarks before we come to an end. So you have the honor to ask the last question.
I'd like to make one more inquiry to the possible future extensions. Whatever happened with the application of Argentina? That was, I don't know, that was 2 or 3 years ago, and then suddenly they withdrew it. And the second one is Turkey. I remember that was 1 year ago or so. It was in the news that they would like to join BRICS too, but I never heard of that too. So what happened with these 2 cases?
Well, I think President Milei doesn't regard BRICS as strategically a value. He also regards it as ideologically repellent because Milei obviously is a free market libertarian, and that approach is very different from certainly the approach of the dominant BRICS partners. I can't say that I know the answer with Turkey. I would imagine it's got to do with geopolitical rivalries within the BRICS membership. I think Pramit can answer that question.
I mean, basically, India refused to allow Turkey in. India and Turkey have had not a very bad relationship, but it's not been a pleasant one. One result of that, curiously, is that Armenia has become the biggest buyer of Indian arms in the world, and we have a strategic partnership, military one, with Greece and Cyprus. But it's really, I mean, I wouldn't say it's a major one, but Turkey has been a big supplier of weapons to Pakistan. And Erdogan has, part of his thing of becoming a leader of the Islamic world, has made a lot of comments about Kashmir and a lot of anti-Modi things. It's not a major problem, but it's been enough for India to say we're not allowing Turkey in.
I also question a little bit the seriousness of the Turkish ambition in that regard, because it knows very well that that's going to be the end of a lot of other relations that are very important. I mean, Turkey is a NATO member. I think that per se excludes a full membership in BRICS because the repercussions of that. But Turkey is very skilled in it. I mean, NATO membership hasn't prevented it from dealing with Russia, right, in terms of web. But I think it would, by choosing BRICS, it would give away so much leverage as a bridge between all these. I don't take it that serious. I think Turkey has been very good in signaling that it could if it wanted to, but I'm not sure it actually really wants to. But that's an informed guess, I would say. It's not.
Before we come to an end, I would like to give each of you the chance to give a core message, not a summary of this discussion. I think that's impossible, but a core message. What should our audience take home today?
So as a researcher, what is really interesting about BRICS now, that it's kind of a barometer. I'm not sure if that's an English word. Yeah. Is it of how in a fragmenting world, these what we call sort of polycentric, like this rise of plurilaterals, how it's actually, if it can work, if they can come to conclusions. I mean, I was waiting for the word Carney to fall in the middle part, but how is this sort of variable geometry, that's how he called it, of different plurilateralists overlapping, issue specific, how is it going to work? And BRICS is a great test case for that. So as a researcher, no matter the normative implications, that really interests me.
So yes, I'd love to build on that. So in India, the word is strategic geometries has been used by our foreign minister for the past 10 years. And at the heart of it is that we see an international order basically falling apart, and one that was underwritten by the United States. And for India, it's been also not perhaps as traumatic as it has been for Europe, but it's given that India over the past 20 years has been moving much, much closer to the United States. And now we're seeing that basically falling apart or becoming extraordinarily difficult to function. And here I would disagree with Toby on one point. I don't think it'll stop even after Trump leaves, because the progressive Democrats or the Democratic Socialists who are now basically taking over the Democratic Party are perhaps not as whimsical and bizarre as Trump, but their fundamental view is still isolationist. America must return home. America must stop sending its sons to die overseas. These global commitments of America are eating away our country. You saw AOC coming out at the Munich Security Conference and saying the global South should not get special favors. Everybody, if it's a rules-based system, the global South has to follow the same rules as the West. And manufacturing must return to America, but that automatically means a protectionist trade policy. There's no other way you can do that. So I would argue that the new consensus in America that is developing on both the Republican and the Democratic side is functionally going to be isolationist. And so this means then what replaces it is extraordinarily difficult to predict. Most governments have no idea. Could it be the Quad? Could it be the BRICS? Could it be just a bunch of middle powers without any name in terms of their cooperation? So governments are all basically trying to sign up with every single bet in town and see which ones function and which ones don't, because a lot of it is not going to be just determined by what the powers do with each other. It's going to be dependent on domestic policies in each of those countries. My company, Eurasia Group, is a risk consultancy, and we spend a lot of time talking to our clients and saying, look, where the problem with middle powers is they don't have a consensus on foreign policy because they've never had to do one. They've always basically run on their own. India's unusual in having an independent foreign policy for such a long time. But a Canadian foreign policy was basically just phone Washington and find out what has to be done. And suddenly now Canada is finding itself, oh God, we need an army. Britain, and I'm not attacking Toby on this, but the British Army now can only field 20,000 soldiers. For India, that's a staggering number because the British Imperial Army was 8 million strong. and 4 million of them were Indians. We and I were discussing how the regiments in the Indian military all are British in origin, the Grenadiers, the Gurkhas, the Fusiliers, the Sikh-like infantry, every single, go to their headquarters. Their commanders were the Duke of Wellington, all of the great British military leaders all ran Indian regiments in the past. And suddenly the British Army is now this tiny, it's got smaller infantry than Nepal, right? And 10% of the British Army is Nepalese. So you suddenly find these middle powers, and everybody's looking at each other, who's going to be able to get out of this rut and find a solution, and it's not clear to anybody. So you're going to see this constant experimentation going on among countries, trying to figure out that solution. And this is now going to be an enormous international challenge. The Indian foreign minister recently speaking at a think tank I work with, the Ananta Aspen Center, was saying he's a professional diplomat. He is actually chosen by Prime Minister Modi because he said this is not about politics. This is about a guy who actually understands what the hell is going on in the world. And he said, the last 5 years has been for me as a professional diplomat for 40 years, the most geopolitically unstable I've ever seen on the world. So the one British diplomat got up and said, what do you predict for the next 5 years? And his response is, the instability you've seen over the past 5 years will pale in comparison to the chaos that's coming.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Pramit said. I think that the uncertainty is the only certainty that we have at the moment, because of the fracturing of the post-war consensus. And obviously since the Cold War, the rise of, the other powers, China, India, the balance of geopolitical powers is shifting dramatically. And most countries are hedging their bets. They don't know which way to go. So they're trying a bit of this and a bit of that. The other thing that we haven't really touched upon is the effect of AI on the power relations between countries, and also the battle between China and America for dominance. And of course, access to resources is going to be critical there as well. And it gives countries which have those resources greater powers, potentially to influence the outcome of that battle. So I think that the next few years are going to be very difficult. So BRICS as an institution has an opportunity to be a force for stability, actually. Contrary to what might be the consensus in the West, that it's going to be a threat. I think that the countries that have the interests of the world at heart, as opposed to BRICS or anybody else, should see BRICS as a stabilizing force. Not a counterbalance to the West, but something which is equivalent to what the West has been able to achieve, but for countries that have been excluded historically.
Thank you so much. I think we couldn't deliver a solution or a clear answer to these questions. I think at the end we raised more questions than we could answer, but still that helps to understand the current geopolitical situation a bit better. And there's definitely the need for more in-depth discussions, research, and we will try to facilitate that from Friedrich-Naumann Foundation. For tonight, all that leaves to me is to say a big thank you to our brilliant panelists. And now I invite my dear colleague Sascha to give the closing remarks.
Good evening from my side. And it's quite a challenge to add something right now. All the final messages, all the ideas, but I try something what liberals are good at. Sometimes out of conviction, sometimes out of necessity. We are optimists. And I try to add some optimism to the debate. The first reason for optimism from my perspective is that we finally discuss all those global issues in depth as Europeans, as Germans. 10 years ago, we did not. We had our values I share, lofty values, and we had thought there's a global trade order and we are the best and everything will turn out good. That doesn't work anymore. We finally understood that as Europeans, latest in 22, probably earlier a little bit, but we deal with those issues. And that's the first reason for optimism. Another one is, and it was finally made this point by Toby, we are not only in a changing world for geopolitical reason, power reason, great power competition reasons, we are in a shifting world because of AI and other technological developments. And finally, I think that at least those technologies rule the world and will rule the world, at least like those global issues, those global competition issues. And that's not only about resources. It's also about resources, but it's about standard setting discussions. AI has a transforming power many of us, me included, do not even imagine right now in its full scale. And is, by the way, since I'm dealing with the United States, somehow I hear this is a power in decline. When I have one conviction, it's not. And AI is one of the reasons for that, not the only one. Second one, as Europeans and as Germans, we have to find our place in this world. And we cannot lag behind in technology and in other issues. And therefore, I want to make one final point based on two ideas, two sets, which have been made on this panel. The first thing is compartmentalization, to compartmentalize our relations with other countries, to deal on common interests, on certain interests, and probably in some relations with other countries, forget about the rest. Not completely. And on the other hand, the point Toby made, we have a set of values like democracy, private property, entrepreneurship, market economy competitions, and we should not forget about this, because they are the secret of success. And therefore, we have to bring this together. Cooperation and dialogue focus on certain issues and still be the West. And therefore, I'm quite optimistic that this starting point, those great global challenges, offer also an opportunity to define the West again and define also liberal values again. It's not an easy task, absolutely not. And one of the things liberals don't like, or I don't like, regarding values, but many liberals don't like, is compromising. To make compromises, but we have to. But it's not a contradiction to compartmentalize, to focus on certain areas, on certain problems with certain partners, and still to be a power for the liberal values, for values which made the world and can make in the future the world a better place. And that's my optimistic outlook, probably too optimistic. But I think we should discuss and argue all those problems we've discussed today. And we have a lot of reason to be optimistic. Chaos always can give chaos, or chaotic circumstances can always also give birth to new ideas and to new institutions. And we should work on this and not be too pessimistic. And that's, thank you again to all our panelists, and thank you to everyone here in the room, and to our moderator as well. And I hope Naumann Foundation, as a liberal foundation, and you stay in touch, and we have a lot of opportunities in the future to discuss all those interesting issues. And thank you also to all people who viewed via our live stream. Thank you very much, and you are now invited outside for further discussions.